Good afternoon, everybody. Maybe good morning for a handful of you, depending on where you are. My name is Haley Yates. I am the Manager of Strategic Solutions here at UBA. And on behalf of United Benefit Advisors, as well as Stevens RX and Navion, I welcome you to today's presentation in the UBA Employee Benefit Webinar Series. Today's topic is Mastering PBM Contracts, and our presenters today are David Keisner and Cheri Rambo. So with that, David and Cheri, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you so much for having us. We'll jump right into it. I always start off with this slide in these types of presentations. I do feel the need to acknowledge, we know there is a small army of pharmacy benefit consultants and analysts and experts out there, and a lot of them are saying the same things. And it can be very difficult from your perspective to determine what's marketing and what's real, who's really negotiating a PBM contract at a high level. And we think one thing that is important for you guys, and that really is our North Star, is the way that we use transparency. Transparency is thrown a lot. That word is thrown around a lot in the PBM contracting space. And we see it as a tool that we use to reach our goal of cost-effective healthcare. We don't just want transparency. We want market level rates. We want market level rebates. We want, well-defined contract terms. So just another way to say it, transparency is not the goal. It's the tool we use to reach our goal. And we think by using that philosophy, we've been able to get some successful PBM contracts and wanted to share some of that with you. So I'll get off my soapbox on that slide. So when you're trying to figure out a PBM contract, the first thing you need to figure out is which PBM you are going to work with. The last I checked, there was something like 77 registered in the United States, and it's probably higher than that now. I've not checked in a few weeks, but there are a lot of PBMs out there, which means there are a lot of PBM contracts out there. And this is my pyramid of PBMs. Each one of these guys has their own contract, maybe multiple versions of a contract that can change year after year. So from your perspective, you can't evaluate hundreds of contracts every year on behalf of the employers you represent. You need some help. So one of the strategies that we think is really important, that's what we do, and what we think is a good strategy for you guys, is we've developed our own PBM contract. Now, this is between the PBM and the employer, but we wrote it. We had our attorneys kind of bless it. Cheri and I spent a lot of time arguing over the terms and what exactly we want and don't want. And then we give that contract to the PBMs and see which ones will accept it. And when you do it that way, when they're playing by our set of rules, it really narrows down the playing field of who's got the best terms, who's playing the way you want to play, and who isn't. So again, a lot of consultants out there, a lot of PBMs out there, very, very hard to navigate. We understand that, and that's kind of why it's so difficult right now. With that said, even though there's a lot of PBMs, we have to be aware the big three dominate the market: CVS, Express Scripts, and Optum. 80% of the market, just mammoth compared to some of those other PBMs. Why does this matter from a contracting perspective? This is something that gets missed in a lot of contracts. Many of these smaller PBMs are leasing the services of one of the big PBMs and not necessarily disclosing that in their contractual terms or through the RFPs. So you may be, what are some of the things that smaller PBMs are using from the big PBMs? A big PBM could lease its rebates, its claims adjudication system, its network, its member call center. And again, this isn't always specified in the contract. So you need to know what services are being kind of subcontracted out, because there is a financial impact from that. The large PBMs, if they're sharing their rebate GPO contracts with the smaller ones, they're not doing that for free. They're often taking a cut of those rebates. So when a smaller PBM says, we're giving you 100% of those rebates, you need to be aware it's 100% of what, say, Express Scripts shared with them, not necessarily 100% of the revenue. And when you kind of dive into that in the contract, you can make sure you're going into this with eyes open and getting fair rates. So that's why lots of PBMs, but still the big three are going to have a big say in your contract no matter who you go with. There are many different types of PBM contracts, and I have to hit on what is called a spread or traditional contract. I'm sure many of you have heard about this. It's made a lot of news, but I always feel the need to address it. We have spread contracts and we have pass-through contracts. In a spread contract, a PBM can charge the employer or the employer's health plan, as I say in this slide, one amount for a medication. they can pay the pharmacy a different amount, and then the PBM keeps the difference, or the spread as we call it. And this is a real example from one of the contracts I've seen a few years back. Esomeprazole, that's generic Nexium. And what we saw in this example was the PBM was charging the employer almost $200 per prescription of generic Nexium, paying the pharmacy, it doesn't say, I just picked a number 30. I guarantee it's a lot less than 189. And then for every one of those generic Nexium prescriptions, the PBM was keeping something like $160. Lots of problems with this, as you can see. And even if they're making up for it with some of the other financials, maybe they have better admin fees and rebates and clinical programs, it's getting really, really tough to justify this in 2025. With all the headlines around this and your members potentially paying the cost of this, it's something to be aware of. So I see a lot of people say, we're making up for it elsewhere. But when this kind of thing gets out there, it's really tough to justify. So just be aware, this is what a traditional or spread pricing arrangement looks like. They're not all this outrageous in their examples, but it's just something we've got to be aware of as we move forward. So with that said, one of my most common questions because of examples like that are, David, I want to leave a larger PBM to go towards a smaller, more transparent PBM. And you see some of the reasons I listed up here. Say, why do you want to leave a bigger PBM? And they say, we're wanting transparency, flexibility, and we're willing to give up the economy of scale pricing we get with the larger PBM to have more flexibility with a smaller PBM. And for a lot of employers, it's really frustrating for me because it feels like they have to make a choice. Do I want the kind of robust financials of a bigger player, or do I want the flexibility of a smaller player? And we're here to tell you it doesn't have to be a choice. With this competitive market, with the scale we've combined between Siemens and Navion, you really can have both in 2025. You don't have to compromise. You can get market level financials and flexibility. So anyone out there who feels like they're struggling with that choice, that's what we want to talk to you about, because the market's competitive, it's changed. You really can't have everything you're looking for. So this is one of my favorite slides. It's meant to look like Google Maps or Apple Maps, because someone once told me, they said, David, it feels like there's a PBM on every corner. And I said, that's exactly what it feels like. I hear about a new one every week. Again, it's really tough to navigate who's a good player and who's not when there's so many out there, when there's literally one on every corner. So how do we figure out which PBM and which PBM contract has the market dynamics that are going to make you successful in your arrangement? And this is actually where I'm going to hand it off to Cheri to go through some of the details on that.
Great. Thank you, David. And I like to tease David about that slide we just saw there, because the first time I saw it, I was like, wait, what? That's a roadmap? That's the PBM on every corner or the pharmacy on every corner? And he's like, yeah, doesn't it look like it? So yes, of course, love that slide now that I've lived through it with David a few times. But getting into the current market dynamics, obviously we know about rising drug costs. We know about the growth of specialty. And I think back to 10 years ago, when we were really looking at specialty, and we were saying, gosh, in 10 years from now, in 2025, we're going to see the growth of specialty be 50% of the pharmacy spend. And here we fast forward those 10 years and we're there. There's a lot of groups, a lot of contracts that we look at that's exactly where they're at. And so it's an unfortunate place to be in, but there was obviously a lot of pipeline around specialty at that time, and obviously the cost and the price tag that go along with it. So here we are today, and what are we going to do about it? And some of the things that we want to talk about, are the development of the high touch intervention. So obviously you've got patient assistance, copay assistance. A lot of folks are now familiar with international sourcing. But now we're also looking at pharmacogenomics as an option. And I myself did a recent cheek swab myself just to get those results and to kind of know, like, what is going to metabolize, what is going to work, what's not going to work for my prescription drugs on a go forward basis. So it really has evolved tremendously. And then you look at, the advancements in consumerism, with with GoodRx, which has been around forever, but then now Mark Cuban. So lots of advancements that we can talk to in more detail about, but wanted to share that. And then, the increased legislation. We're going to see lots about the increased legislation, and David will share more on that here in a little bit. But what I wanted to do today was really kind of just break out a little bit of the cost of the drugs that we're seeing. And on this slide, you'll see in brand drugs, 13.6% of the claims represent 36% of spend. Those are claims like Trulicity, Eliquis, Ozempic. And then you've got generic drugs at 85% of the claims volume or 22% of the spend. And those are your drugs like the omeprazole, gabapentin, and so forth. And then your specialty, in this slide, we're showing 42% of spend overall, or 1.4% of claims. So while I said we're seeing groups in our book of business at 50%, we're definitely seeing those, but there are some that are lower as well. But then examples of specialty obviously are Humira, Enbrel, and Stelara. Okay. We also just wanted to touch on over-the-counter medications. A lot of folks, are very familiar with over-the-counter medications, but some of those drugs don't need to even be covered on the plan, right? You can exclude those and just get those covered outside of the benefit at a much lesser price. That's an option that we can talk about. And then biosimilars, gosh, we're all hearing a lot about biosimilars. And they've been known to show no clinically meaningful difference from the reference product. But when I was looking at biosimilars specifically, what I found interesting was a comment that Becky shared with me a couple of days ago. And in Humira, she was saying, is the best selling drug of all time. When it first faced biosimilars in the marketplace in 2023, generating $21 billion in 2022. That just blew my mind. And then you look at Stelara, a J&J drug, and that one is getting competition January of 25, so just the beginning of this year, and it had prices of $10.36 billion. So with the biosimilar marketplace, there's obviously alternatives to that. Some of the programs and things that we're looking at give lower cost options, which are very helpful. So those are some of the things that we wanted to kind of touch at on a high level when it comes to biosimilars. And then just again, looking at the generic cost increase. So personally, I like this slide because in 2007 is when I started in pharmacy. And so I know it was a long time ago, David, don't laugh. So started at the generic cost of drugs at that time, $23, and now $27. So a 24% increase. Doesn't sound, that harmful. But then you look at the next slide and we'll talk a little bit about the brand cost increase. And the brand increase from $23 to $28. I'm sorry, the brand went from $85 to $593. So a 594% increase from a brand standpoint. And then I'm sure you know what's coming next, right? The specialty cost increase went from $516 to $5,916 in 2023. So we've definitely seen the significant increases. I think these slides are valuable because it really puts into perspective what we've seen over time. And again, I think this conversation is helpful because it's going to talk through contracts and how we can help you as we move on through the presentation. Some of the clinical specialty and cost containment solutions, you've got physician detailing, therapeutic interchange programs, point of sale discount card programs, the manufacturer assistance and patient assistance. We're also seeing, integrated cash discounts, as I mentioned, Mark Cuban. So, not to kind of sit on all of these, but just want to share with you, there are a lot of options. And when we do our analysis, we actually include not just the contract terms, but we also show what do these options look like as well. And then we take into account the rebate impact so that at the end of the day, what are my net savings? So wanted to be able to share that with you. And obviously we share disruption along with any of the programs at the same time and walk through that process. Okay. And then finally, from a PBM pricing strategy consideration from my perspective, and what we'll talk a little bit more, what you traditionally see, as David mentioned earlier, traditional or pass-through, traditional being spread, the various rebate arrangements that we constantly are looking at, hey, what does a percentage share mean versus a flat rebate? And what's a rebate reinvestment model? And then there's MAF retention, which we could spend a lot of time on that, but we won't. In addition, you'll see here, various specialty arrangements, formulary arrangements, other considerations. I think one of the advantages for sure when you're working with us is the formulary ability that we have, and a lot of the time and care that we've taken at looking at, what should be covered, what shouldn't be covered, and we have a lot of say in that with the partners that we work with. So with this, I want to turn it back over to David because he is going to share some additional items with you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheri. So this is one of my favorite things to do when we're in a live audience. I don't know how well it's going to work on Zoom, but I'm going to go ahead and give it a try just because I think it's always fun. So we've gone through a lot of things related to PBM contracts. But ultimately, at the end of the day, when you're talking to your clients, you're reviewing something like what I've showed on the screen here. You're looking at 2 PBM bids. You're looking at network discounts from brand and generic for 30-day, 90-day, and mail. So how well can the PBM negotiate with their provider network, Walmart, Walgreens, CVS, Kroger? What kind of discounts can they get through those pharmacies? But also, how well do they negotiate with pharma, with Pfizer, Merck, and the like to get those rebates back? And what you see here are 2 PBM bids where we're trying to evaluate which PBM strategy is better. PBM 1, I'll just jump to it. They have a specialty rebate guarantee of nearly $3,000. And with the rising cost of specialty, that can look really, really appealing, right? And I mean, it is appealing. And when you look at PBM 2, their specialty rebate guarantee per claim is half of that. So you say, okay, well, rising cost of specialty, maybe that's not the best bid, but this PBM has better discounts through their provider network. They've been able to negotiate deeper discounts on brand, mail, generics, again, at Walmart, Walgreens, Kroger, CVS, and the like. So you're left there in front of a client and you say, PBM 1, better rebates, particularly on those specialty meds, which is the biggest kind of cost increase we're seeing, as Cheri said. PBM 2, really focused on kind of those network discounts. And the big question is, which strategy is better? Which is going to have the lowest net cost for the employer that you represent? So this is the time in the live presentation where I say, I want everyone to vote. And obviously, we're not going to do that here. I say, which bid do you think will have the lowest net cost for an employer? And I'll just tell you, most people pick PBM 2. Most people say rebates are a game. We don't like the game of rebates. You need to focus on just the cost of goods. That's the strategy that wins. I'll get a few stragglers who say, no, rebates. That's particularly around specialty drugs. That's where we need to focus our attention. And maybe a third of the room will say PBM 1 is the winner because they focus on specialty rebates. And then, of course, my punchline, I love to do it. I get to say, guess what? Everybody's wrong. The whole room is wrong. You misread it. These were actually the exact same bid when you look at the net cost. We're talking within pennies. This isn't hypothetical. We see this literally all the time. What you didn't have were 2 PBMs being competitive. You had 2 underwriters really trying to trick you to show that their strategy looks better than the other guy's strategy. And if you don't have a claims analytics system that can kind of figure this out, you're really flying blind. So this is a situation, again, we see all the time. We'll go back to the PBMs and say, I see what you're doing. Guys, sharpen your pencils. I think you can both do better. And normally they can. I mean, and then again, if you really want to go down the rabbit hole, sometimes PBM 2 has an ownership structure in PBM 1. Sometimes they share the same rebate aggregator. So it almost feels like they're in cahoots. And then you get the same bid. So one of the biggest games we're seeing right now is kind of how they manipulate the metrics in the contract for optics, but not necessarily for kind of that financial benefit that we're looking for. Again, using transparency to get the better price, not just saying it's transparent and walking away. And that's, I think, a good example of this. I hope I tricked some in the audience. I guess I'll never know. But I'm going to go ahead and say it went well in my head. So thank you, Cheri. Cheri likes it.
I love it.
Okay. Again, with that theme of using transparency to get what we want in terms of better financial and overall healthcare for an employer, this is an example from a few years ago I just love. And if you look at the top left, this was an employer we worked with who loved their PBM contract. It was transparent. They had formulary control. And you can see in 2022, they had a PMPM of $77, which they were happy with. They were with a different PBM, or their PBM was way, way higher than before. So I came to talk to them and they said, David, our PBM contract is great. Our PMPM is something we're comfortable with. We have transparency. Everything's good. And I said, can I just look at your contract and financials? Let me just take a look and see what we're dealing with. And when I looked at it, it was transparent, but I like to say it was kind of transparently bad. Their admin fees were well above market and their rebates were well below market. So what we were able to do is say, let's keep the things you like. Again, you can have it all. Let's keep the things you like in your PBM contract. I want to keep the transparency. I want to keep the flexibility to do those clinical programs you like, control the formulary. But we've got to talk about those admin fees and rebates. I know rebates are a dirty word, but we can't ignore them. So all we did in this situation, we renegotiated the financial terms of their contract. And you can see there on the bottom, we were able to greatly decrease those admin costs, greatly increase the rebates, keep everything else they like, and lower their PMPM from $77 to $59. And what's so great about this is there's not member disruption. No one's having to switch meds or switch pharmacies. It's really kind of a behind the scenes contractual savings that just is so palatable for employers because we're not chasing savings and making people jump through hoops to get them. So again, say it 1,000 times, using transparency to get what we want, to get those market level rates. And this is just one of my favorite examples. All right, we have to acknowledge, though, in the contracting space, there are some lawsuits, some ERISA fiduciary lawsuits that have made a lot of headlines. These are lawsuits against the employer's health plan for not meeting their ERISA fiduciary responsibility. We have J&J and we have a Wells Fargo one. Now, I know these have been dismissed, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But when these came out, the headline grabbing feature was these generic specialty medications. They would say through the large PBM, the health plan, the employer paid $10,000 for a specialty generic medication. And if we look that medication up on GoodRx or Mark Cuban, we see that the market price is much less, just $100. I'll make up a number. And so those made the headlines. These PBMs are charging employers thousands of dollars for medications that can be, sourced elsewhere for much cheaper. And I get why that makes the headlines. It's extremely frustrating. And to be clear, we're not in favor of that practice at all. But what I was worried about and what has come to fruition was, are they going to say you're cherry picking claims that are not representative of the overall financials of an employer's health plan? Is that where these are going to fail? And ultimately, we saw in the Wells Fargo one, which was dismissed. I don't have the exact quote from me, but the judge said something to the effect of, I get these examples are bad, they're frustrating, but you haven't proven they're representative of the overall financial health of that employer's health plan. So we do think these lawsuits are going to continue, but they're probably not going to focus on just these specific examples. They're going to be more encompassing. It won't be the headline grabbing stuff. We're going to look at those admin fees. We're going to look at the rebates. We're going to look at termination language in a PBM contract. That's often one of the biggest issues I see. You want to get out of your PBM contract, but the termination language is so cumbersome, and maybe there's financial penalties to get out that you can't do it. We're looking at the definitions of specific terms. How do you define average wholesale price? How do you define generic drug? How do you define brand drug? We have to look at all together, and that's what we do. And so, again, while these examples make the headlines, I think it's the boring stuff, all the things I talked about that are really going to drive the next round of lawsuits and conversation. And that's what we're trying to get ahead of right now. Some behind the scenes details in the contract that I think will protect you going forward. So again, we're trying to check all the boxes of what you need from a PBM contract. One thing I really want to point out is even when you're in an arrangement you're happy with and everything's going well, it still has to be managed. It's a bit of a living organism to some extent. You were able to negotiate a custom drug formulary, but who's going to manage the drug formulary, right? Who's going to do the clinical review to make sure the employees of that health plan, that employer, are getting cost-effective healthcare? And that's where I think we come in and our expertise really shines, because this changes every year. Sometimes it feels like it changes every day. And if you're not actively managing those terms moving forward, you did a lot of negotiation, really, kind of for nothing. And so having the oversight, having the third party clinical expertise to manage your contract, we think is where a lot of the future is going to lie. And that's where I think Cheri and I's forces combined, where we're so excited. She was a PBM exec for a number of years. We've worked together for a decade. Steven started with clinical management, moved into the kind of the contracting space. Cheri, lots of behind the scenes knowledge and contracting expert herself. So we really complement each other well to bring our forces together, to bring employers and UBA firms. We think some of the things that are really, really important. And just one example from this slide I'll give, Department of Labor audit. I know that's something everyone is always a little worried about. We had a client once get an audit, and they had a custom transparent formulary, and the auditor said, hey, you got a good looking contract, but do you have a third party clinical expert who's managing your drug plan moving forward? Meaning you can't rely on the PBM. If you're going to be a fiduciary, it's not the PBM's responsibility. You need to make sure you have someone who's unbiased. And we think that's where we come in. Not relying on the PBM's pharmacist to make the formulary recommendations. Let us do it in kind of a fair and transparent way. So with that said, I'll leave it to Cheri here to kind of wrap up and bring it all together.
Yeah, thank you, David. Again, very good points kind of throughout the presentation. We always want to end on, what takeaways can you then have, based on all of the information that we just shared with you. Happy to answer any questions in any format, now at the conclusion of this webinar, and or, email or however you'd like to reach out to us. But some of the things that we suggest that you do is, always request a PBM claim file so that you can perform the analysis. Obviously, if you can get a copy of the contract with, rebates and admin fees, that's even better. It allows us to do kind of a quick mini audit for you. Also, auditing and reconciliation, your rebates versus your in-force contract terms. Again, sometimes it's you've moved on, you've chosen a PBM. Maybe that PBM was on a spreadsheet last year and they were in your first position, right? And you dismissed 3 or others. But then did you have any way to verify that, for example, $100,000 of savings was actually generated, right? Did you make sure that happened at the end of the year? And again, between the reconciliation, the review of both contract terms and rebates, those are some of the services that we do to make sure that happens. Also, obviously, always reviewing your cost containment options and determining optional savings opportunities. So we vet all of the programs that we work with. But again, it's always good to look at what are you doing today? Because even if it's something they weren't interested in 6 months ago, they might be now interested in the next 6 months, or somebody else is going to be talking to them about those options. So we always suggest that you're, taking a look at all of the savings opportunities and then performing an annual market check. I mean, it's in a lot of contracts. And then there's some of the transparent contracts that actually don't acknowledge an annual market check. So that's another area where we suggest that you make sure that you've got language in there for an annual market check and that those are performed. And then annual contract true ups from your PBM. So again, making sure that if you've got a contract in place today, and the PBM has been performing very well, that's awesome, because you can find out, did they perform per the contract, or do they need to write me a check? And a lot of times, they're probably not going to jump up and down and say, hey, I owe you a check. So that would be, another area for you to kind of take into account and look into. So those are the takeaways that we wanted to share with you. Again, appreciate everybody's time and having us with you here today, and happy to take any questions. Haley, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I know it takes an extra minute to physically type a question. So I have the Q&A open. If I see anything come through, we'll get that answered. We do have a couple more minutes here, but if you're looking to reach out to Cheri or David for our UBA firms who are on this call, Cheri's information is on the community to reach out to. Otherwise, this webinar is recorded and will be shared via our public site, as well as a LinkedIn post next week. So you'll be able to see their contact information to reach out if necessary. Haven't seen anything come through. Again, if there's any questions at any point, feel free to reach out to me as well, and I will get you in contact with the right person. I'm sure David and Cheri will be more than happy to chat. But at this time, I do want to thank David and Cheri specifically for your thought leadership today and sharing your expertise, and thank all of our attendees who joined us today. Our next webinar will be June 17th, and that topic will be navigating high-cost healthcare and strategies for effective cost management with Allied. So we look forward to you joining us next month.
Great.